Hello, everyone. This is chapter 5, and the lecture I've derived from it. And really, the purchase is on the mind. Really, the purpose of these lectures, I just do want to reiterate, is your textbook is packed with a lot of awesome material. And sure, a lot of folks out there don't like textbooks. I think a good textbook can be a delight and a joy and can really add badly needed context and sequence to historical events. Yet at the same time, it's a lot of information to absorb. So the purpose of my lectures, in-person lectures, as well as out-of-class lectures, is to extract those things that I find to be the most important, the biggest takeaways that I want you to get. And I link those takeaways to terms that Foner has called out in his text so that when you go back and review this material, and you will need to do that for midterms and finals, that you know where to find the capsule of information surrounding it so that you can integrate the material of this lecture with what Foner has to say, which is going to have some similarities and some differences of emphasis, and some differences of context, according to what I feel is most important for you to learn. But you will be able to reference that fairly quickly, know where to find it, and put together the two capsules of information that you're getting, my own and Foner's, which are going to have some cross-pollinizations, and as I said, are going to have some key differences. You should note I am never going to disagree with Foner, because there is such a thing as historical fact. If not historical truth, there is historical fact, and the facts agree. However, I have different ways of packaging my ideas, and I also take out some of the discursive elements of Foner so that you get a more direct analysis of why I emphasize certain points. So I did just want to reiterate that at the beginning of this lecture, and also give you some time to note what the terms are that I'm going to expect you to know. Excuse me, and those terms are going to show up later in the semester in the form of some sort of midterm evaluation. And as of this point, I'm still a little unclear about what I'm going to do with that. But you will certainly know soon. I will always give you very ample time to complete all of your assignments. The other thing I wanted to say, and this is kind of a weird thing, is that we're on chapter 5, and we've already moved from pre-Columbus up to the early 1760s. And this is significant because from after this point, we are only going to be discussing about 80 more years. So we've moved several hundred. And now we're going to really drill down and look at 80 to 90 critical years for the rest of the semester. And that's going to encompass the remainder of our 10 weeks of lecture. So I just wanted to make that point. From this point forward, the lectures are going to have fewer slides. I'm going to go through fewer terms, and I'm going to drill down into them more completely, because we'll be entering a time when the United States exists. The United States is struggling to figure out what it is, and what it means, and what it means in terms of freedoms for its peoples, the democratic republic that it will become, how that evolves, and what it means to be different from a monarchy, what it means to be separate from Europe, what it means to attempt to keep that energy going in terms of this experiment of people being able to govern themselves. So that will be the focus of the next couple weeks, the next several weeks. This is the longest PowerPoint until we get to the American Civil War. So just bear that in mind as well. We're going to do a very quick thumbnail jump, as one does in survey courses, through the American Revolution. By point of contrast, I'm teaching an entire course on just colonial and revolutionary America for advanced history students this semester. So there's a lot to drill down into, and there's a lot of material to pursue if you're interested. I am very happy to have discussions that point you in those directions. If you ever want to Zoom me during office hours to find out how to learn more, I do find that students really tend to be interested in war. And in some cases, it's because war has this equipment and showcases these technological advancements that students find to be really interesting. But on the other hand, wars change things. They change attitudes toward race. They change attitudes toward gender. They change attitudes toward work. They change attitudes toward lived lives and the geopolitics of the planet. So to say that you're interested in a war doesn't necessarily mean that you're only interested in the hardware and the tactics and strategy. There are many things that come out of war that are really going to be highlighted during the course of the rest of our semester too. So bear that in mind as you explore your own interests in terms of this topic. So our first topic for exploration, we'll call it exploration Chmielewski style, if you will, is called by Foner, The Crisis Begins. And based on last week's lecture, you might be able to guess what this crisis is. And certainly from your reading, you should have read the book by now. I kind of remember that. The crisis begins, and that crisis is going to be America's ideological separation from its mother country, if you will. I know that's a very gendered term. Maybe we should call it home country, which is England. And I just want to underscore a few things about this relationship. So it is 1763, and France and England have come to the bargaining table in terms of ending this conflict that we know as the 7 Years' War, which, to reiterate its weirdness, had spanned from 1754 to 1763 in the American colonies, but was a 7-year conflict everywhere else. It was really kind of considered the First World War, if you will, in a lot of ways, because it spans all the way to India and into Indonesia, and it opens up all of these wounds among European nations as they struggle to maintain their invasive power hold over other parts of the globe. So the fallout from this particular conflict that really interests us is that the French are on the losing side of this conflict. They know it, and they have done two things. They have bargained away Canada and Louisiana, two massive colonies that are held by the French on a map, and they are known as Le Canada and La Louisiane. These take up an enormous chunk of the North American continent. But what is really important to remember, as I've said in previous lectures, just because Europeans claim something on a map doesn't mean that they can fully execute its influence in reality. And that is most definitely the case of the French. For the first time, they really fail in understanding the strategy and tactics of their Native American allies, and that is going to contribute to significant battlefield losses for the French, and the force of them to come to the bargaining table with the English. The English have put significant pressure on the French in the New World, and as a result have captured their significant New World capitals of Quebec, which is located right here on the St. Lawrence River, and that is the seed of French cultural life in the New World and French religious life, which is very important to the French, and French administrative life. And then the year after that, they seized Montreal. Forgive me if I go on by this. I mourn about it every time I talk about it, because we might have had a very different national story if those two strongholds of the French Empire had not fallen to the English. We might have had an extremely different national story, starting with passports and driver's licenses written in a different language. And most specifically, we might have had a very different story when it came to the treatment of the native peoples of the Americas. I'm not sure about human enslavement. The French could be extraordinarily brutal enslavers of their fellow human beings. But in terms of Native Americans, they were quite different from the English, and different in ways that might be more appealing to modern people. So I just put that out there for you to ponder. What if, in history, this is called a counterfactual, the what if. What if Quebec had not fallen to the English in 1759 and Montreal had not fallen to the English in 1760? How might a sense of nationhood in North America been different? It's a very compelling idea, but it isn't what happened. That's not the historical facts of the case, and those are the things that we really need to work with now. So, getting to the beginning of the crisis, which had a very long ramp up, treaty is signed in Paris in 1763, and the French are going to give away all of their North American holdings. England is going to claim all of Le Canada, which is this entire region here, some of which had already fallen into English hands. Oh, I'm sorry, here. And the French are going to cede away the central part of their nation, of what they claim in North America, the Louisiana Territory, to the Spanish. And this is going to have very interesting consequences in a couple of weeks when we talk about, for my money, what is the most important revolution of the Western Hemisphere, the revolution in Haiti, where enslaved peoples take themselves out of enslavement and completely revolutionize that island, and has profound consequences for the new United States and also for European politics. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. But for now, why have the French given away these huge chunks of land? Because it gives them a little bit of a bargaining chip, and it allows them to hold on to their sugar colonies in the Caribbean, where they, like other Europeans, practice some of the roughest, crudest, cruelest, and most racist forms of human enslavement on the globe. But that is a system that makes the French a lot of money, and they want to retain that money. The fur trade made the money too, but not as much money as sugar. So it's very important for them, from their perspective, to retain those sugar islands. So what is this crisis being referred to here? Okay, if you woke up in Philadelphia and you were a person of English extraction, you would be very happy in the summer of 1763, because the hated French had been driven from the continent. And you could look at the world and say, you know, I'm kind of proud to be a subject of the English Empire. Of course, provided you are of European colonial extraction, where suddenly your hated enemies, the French, are kicked off the continent, and you have a king who is basically kept in check by a constitution that guarantees certain elements of your personal liberty. So you're really kind of happy to be part of this English empire, provided you're of Euro-American background. Certainly people of Native American and African extraction would have reasons to be not so happy. We'll talk about those reasons as this lecture goes on. But the colonists who came from Europe are looking at the world and thinking, okay, we're looking at a time of bright prosperity. Suddenly, our abilities to move the West and to get at this rich farmland are no longer going to be hamstrung by the fact that our hated enemies, the French, claim this interior and are going to do everything in their power to keep us out. And our frontiers in New England are now secure because these are English frontiers. We no longer bump up against the French and have these periodic and highly destructive wars where people living on frontiers are going to be killed and others are going to be seized and will be subjects of the French king, and that will be a terrible thing for New England families. So there's reason to be happy. but there's also reason to be deeply concerned. And that's going to happen as the next year rolls around. In a previous lecture, I talked about this topic called salutary neglect, which was that the English had rules about how their colonists had to trade. And these rules were aimed at making the British Empire overall money. And that money was supposed to support all types of projects and improvements, and also give money to the discretionary use of British ruling elites. So that revenue was extremely important. Well, it costs a lot of money to move an army across the Atlantic Ocean and feed it and house it and uniform it and equip it for a period of multiple years. And that is exactly what happened in the 7 Years' War. These tremendous expenses related to kicking the French off of the North American continent. In short, England's broke. England is now officially really broke. So, what does it see as its possible way out of this financial crisis? The end of salutary neglect, which means that prior to the 7 Years' War, the colonists had been expected to govern and chiefly to protect themselves. And that was a very good financial trade-off to the English. In exchange for that, the English, as long as they were making some money off of their colonies, allowed the colonists to do a bit of smuggling, to do a bit of illegal trading with other trading partners that technically was beyond the letter of the law, but the English allowed it because the colonists were protecting themselves. And that was considered to be a respectable trade-off. Now the colonists no longer needed to do that because they were no longer going to be called to protect themselves. The English had sent over a professional fighting force. There are professional armies now stationed in the English colonies, and the French threat has been nullified. So what better thing to do than put the English soldiers who are stationed now in the New World in a time of peace to work making sure that American colonists follow those navigation acts and end salutary neglect. So no more smuggling, no more making money off of illegal trade partners, and no longer an English desire to turn a blind eye to some illegal activity with the trade-off that the colonists would take care of themselves, govern themselves, and ensure that that revenue now went to England. This becomes especially relevant with a series of what seem to be relatively small legislative bits and pieces that come out of the British Parliament, which is the ruling body of men, and I emphasize of men, there were no women in Parliament in the 18th century, who are elected or chosen by nature of their birth. There are two houses in Parliament, the House of Lords and the House of Commons, to make laws for not only England at home, but also England's colonies. Prior to 1763, Parliament really let the colonies govern themselves. And their little legislatures would make laws about how much tax money was owed to the individual colony by colonists. And then that colony, through its legislature, would bundle up all that money and give what they perceived to be a gift to their king for his just leadership of their colonies. Parliament did not get involved in this. This was what was called a direct tax, and that meant that people that were elected by you made decisions about how much tax you would pay. This changes notably in 1763 and 1764. Parliament looks around, discerns that England is broke, and comes up with what they feel will be an easy solution. They have never imposed their own taxes on the colonies because they felt that the colonies governed themselves and gave some money as was suitable to the English crown. Well, now they need money, and they still have the right to tax the colonies, or they feel they have the right, even though they have never done that. So it becomes very smart and useful to a significant majority of parliamentarians, though certainly not all. Some parliamentarians think this is a colossally stupid idea, and they let their colleagues know that, to say, okay, Parliament is going to pass a tax, and the colonies are going to have to pay that tax. And that's that. They're going to tax certain items, and a tax will be paid on these items, and it will be paid directly to Britain. It will not be paid to the American legislatures, and also the American colonial legislatures will have no say in this tax. They're not going to say we want this tax or don't want it. So I hope I'm making the distinction clear. Prior to this, the English colonies taxed themselves, governed themselves, and gave some revenue to the British monarch. But now the situation has changed. A ruling body at home where the American colonists have no sitting member is saying, okay, colonies, we are making a decision for you. And this decision is you will pay us certain tax revenue on imported items from England. This is something called the Stamp Act. And it is issued formally in 1764. I want to get something out on the table really, 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 really prominently before we even start talking about this. The Stamp Act and its predecessor, known as the Sugar Act, which added a light tax on sugar, and the subsequent what are called revenue acts, which are Parliament's actions to raise money from the colonists without the colonists giving their express approval or being asked for any input, are never, ever, ever about the amount of money. These taxes are puny, and they only affect certain items. They're small, they're infinitesimal. But by making the colonists pay these taxes, the British Parliament is looking to affirm its right to tax the colonists and its right to tax them in a certain way without going through colonial leaders, whether those colonial leaders are at home at those little colonial legislatures, or because Parliament has allowed the colonists to send representatives who actually sit in Parliament. Do the colonists have people looking out for their interests in England already? Yes, they do. Every single colony has a person known as an agent. Benjamin Franklin is the most famous agent of all. He spends many, many years in England representing the interests of Pennsylvania, but he does not sit in Parliament. He's not offered a seat in Parliament, and neither are any of his fellow agents who are in the same position. So this is the real distinction. It's the right to tax that is being tested. Now, if the right to tax was successfully established, then perhaps these taxes could become exorbitant. The British taxpayer already pays 10 times what the American colonial taxpayer pays. They already pay that. The people in England are really shouldering the vast responsibility of the expenses that it takes to run the British Empire. So it's not like England's sitting back pretty and saying, okay, let's just squeeze these colonists. They're not. But who's to say what could happen if they had successfully established the right? That is what has the American colonists so up in arms with this piece of legislation called the Stamp Act. Here's what the Stamp Act was. It basically said any one of a number of items or services sold in the colonies would be subject to a very small tax. To demonstrate that you paid the tax, your item or proof of your service would have to carry this stamp here in order to be a legal sale or a legal execution of a document. So here's an example of what I mean. Let's say one of the members of this class wants to sell a piece of property, and the sale of that piece of property needs to go through certain colonial offices to demonstrate that the property was sold and is now the rightful property of somebody else. The document, which was called an indenture, and actually still is called an indenture. If any of you own real estate, you know that when you signed off your mortgage paperwork, it says at the very beginning, this indenture would have to carry one of these stamps. And only if it carried one of these stamps would it then be complete and legal and recognized. This is what the British government is saying. So this means that lawyers who are involved in the execution of all these legal documents are going to be really angry because they're the ones that have to pay for the stamp, or they have to pass the cost of that stamp on to their customers. And so their customers are going to be angry too. So who does this legislation really get angry? Colonial lawyers, who are some of the most articulate and argumentative people in colonial society. They're going to be really angry about the Stamp Act. What other items are going to carry stamps? Liquor, cards, dice, pastimes, basically, luxuries that people don't necessarily need. By liquor, I'm talking about imported spirits and wines rather than, homebrew beer or cider, which is what most people drank. But who is that going to irritate? That's going to irritate sailors who are in port, who rely on these pastimes to kind of pass their time and occupy them. Suddenly, they're going to have to pay more money for their booze and more money for their dice and their cards. And they're going to be really angry too. And they are some of the most boisterous people in colonial society. So if you look at the Stamp Act, you can really see it as one of the worst pieces of legislation ever conceived in the 18th century colonial world. It's getting some of the most already agitated people in colonial society even more agitated. What is going to happen? They are going to call to the attention of the colonists that the British Empire is attempting an act of, and I will attempt to annotate here, even though I find it very difficult, so I apologize. T word, tyranny. The British Empire is being tyrannical, not in terms of taking huge chunks of people's property with their new tax laws, but in terms of attempting to establish the right to tax. Lawyers are going to write very passionate and thought-provoking tracts denouncing the Stamp Act, and sailors and dock workers and other young men who have limited work to do and are seeing their income shrink conceivably because of these taxes and the few pleasures that they have in life being sopped up by these taxes, they are going to join in the protests against this act. It is going to raise a firestorm of anti-parliamentarian activity everywhere in the 13 colonies. Not so much in Canada, which is still under martial law and is in a very different legal situation. Not in the sugar colonies that the British have, for a very good reason, because so many of the taxpayers there made scads of money off of sugar, off of the backs of enslaved people, and they picked up, moved back to Britain, and bought property. So they're actually represented in Parliament. Americans are not, and that's why they are so furious about this particular situation. So let's talk a little bit about this topic of taxation without representation. This has both a literal meaning and an ideological meaning. And I'd like to discuss both with you because I think they're really important to understand why there was such a tremendous cleft that opens up between these colonies, which in 1763 had been very proud and very happy to be part of the British Empire, and the resulting revolution that breaks out a mere 12 years later, in which, for many colonists, though certainly not all, as we'll learn during the course of this lecture, remaining under the leadership of the British Empire was almost unconscionable. So here are two, I think, relatively powerful images of these protests that erupt in the colonies. And one of them is of, you can see these are not literal human beings being hung. They are what are called effigies, or they're kind of, straw or stuffed versions meant to represent people. They're meant to represent the person who distributes these stamps, because if the stamps cannot be distributed, then the tax on them cannot be collected and sent to England. So America's whole idea is to intimidate these stamp collectors from actually seeing these stamps distributed and executed, so that the tax cannot be paid. And you might say, well, if it's a small amount, what was the big deal? The big deal is taxation without representation and what it represented to many people. 18th century people, from many walks of life, from those who are living in circumstances that are unfree, all the way up to those who are living in what in the colonies would be the highest level of opulence, are very, very sensitive to power, especially those who have freedoms. I mean, those who don't have freedoms know what it's like to not have them. And those who do have freedoms know what it's like to observe people who don't have freedom, and they know how truly dreadful it is. So their concern is that the British Empire is going to, without asking for their approval, gradually whittle away at their freedoms as colonists. And you might say, well, how could that really happen? They're separated by the Atlantic Ocean. Well, it could happen this way, in the sense that the colonial, the British soldiers who were brought to the New World during the 7 Years' War have not been withdrawn. So you have armies of people who are in colonial cities waiting to make sure that these taxes are paid, and also making sure that these riots by people who see themselves as British citizens, the American colonists, do not get out of hand. And that is the root of the ideological issue here. And it represents a real separation in thought between the British back in England and their colonists. And it's this: the colonists have for a very long time seen themselves as subjects of the British monarch. They might be living in the colonies, but they are Englishmen and English women worthy of the rights that Englishmen and English women enjoy back in England. The imposition of these taxes tells them something about how the English back in England see them, and that to them that is not good. They have not been asked what their opinion is on these taxes, even if they live good and fruitful lives, and even if they own a lot of property, even if they have a higher standard of living than their comparable person who is living in England, that they are looked at as a lesser person in the British Empire, that a colonist is not the same as a subject. They always thought it was. The imposition of these taxes, and specifically the execution of the Stamp Act, suggests to them that they are not of the same level as British men and women back in England, subjects of the British monarch, and they are furious about that distinction. That distinction to them is wrong and inaccurate. It doesn't adequately represent the relationship that they always understood they had with the parent country of England. And England is seemingly telegraphing to them, you're colonists. You're different. You're not the same as we are. And the colonists are saying, we are the same as you are. And in order for us to pay taxes, we need to have representatives in Parliament. And the English are saying, no, you don't. You're colonists, and we have always made rules for you. This just hasn't really struck you until now, what this relationship has always been. And the colonists feel that, why do we need to have this relationship? And this gets to the real root of the matter. You can look at both sides and you can look at both arguments. Fundamentally, the crisis could have been solved with a sharing of leadership, with saying to the individual colonies, okay, give us representatives to sit in Parliament to represent your interests. But in England, that standard had always been based on owning land back in England itself. And to the English, the colonies were not England. They were the colonies. They were a lesser form of land ownership. And they were not going to bend on the way they perceived that. It could have been solved. Here's representation. But they were not going to completely reroute and reimagine the way they saw England versus the way they saw English colonies. This is going to lead to, in many American cities, of which there are quite a few at this point, ranging from New Hampshire all the way down to Georgia, with a firestorm of violence. So here we have the intimidation of the tax man, and this very interesting little object here called a Phrygian cap, which was the Roman symbol of freedom to slaves. So that tells us something. Sometimes people who legitimately owned enslaved, kidnapped Africans, see themselves potentially as slaves to paying the taxes of the British Empire. And then we see American colonists taking things into their own hands to intimidate England's representatives in the colonies with threats of intimidation and violence. So here we see a noose hanging from a tree, from Liberty Tree, that is. That is an attempt to intimidate the tax man as well. And then here we see a figure here, and he looks very strange to us, right? He looks like he's covered in feathers. And guess what? He is covered in feathers. He is the victim of something called tarring and feathering, and he's having tea involuntarily poured down his throat to symbolically make him sick, and probably to literally make him sick if somebody is forcing something down your throat that you don't want. Tarring and feathering was an act of profound violence against a human being. Usually it was affected by a mob. They would take someone, the target of their violence, strip that person naked, cover them with pine tar, which when it's soft would have to be hot, and then throwing feathers all over that person and making them look like the laughable form of a human goose. To call somebody a goose was an insult. So they basically transformed this person into a goose. It might sound like a very quaint and silly form of punishment. It was not. It was potentially uh, homicide by a mob. In this way, the goose, the human target, would then be paraded through the streets. The person would be hit with clubs and other blunt instruments, sometimes knocked unconscious, sometimes given a head wound that would kill them. If they survived this gauntlet of abuse, then the simple removal of the tar and the feathers could take with it huge slabs of skin, exposing an 18th century person before antibiotic ointments or antibiotics themselves to infection that would eventually kill them. So it was a very effective way of a mob in a form that was not punishable, killing someone that they really hated or threatening someone with violence so extreme that it would eventually kill them. What happens as a result of the Stamp Act? The act is unexecutable in the United States. Stamp collectors resign in droves. They will not put their lives on the line. They are like those colonial administrators we talked about in lecture 4. They know what the law is, but they cannot execute the law. And they're not going to put their lives on the line to execute the law, which means the Stamp Act cannot be executed. What is the result of this? A miracle by colonial standards. The Stamp Act will be repealed a year later. The British government is going to say, okay, this attempt at raising revenue was a complete and utter failure. It cannot be done, so we're going to repeal it. There is a tremendous sigh of relief and the ringing of church bells and the outpouring of tears and thanks that the colonies feel toward their monarch and their leaders, that they have so wisely and justly repealed an act that made their colonists so unhappy. They can't believe that they have the luxury of living under a system in which a king and leaders listened and they realized that they were unjust and they repealed an unpopular act. So the colonists celebrate and they think, okay, we won. England understands us. England understands that as subjects of the British Empire, I'm sorry, folks, in case you're confused, I'm using British and English interchangeably. I can at this point in history, so just if you wouldn't mind rolling with it, British and English are virtually interchangeable at this point. That how lucky are they to live under the auspices of the great justice of the British Empire? Did something stupid, but then realized it did something stupid and fixed its mistake. What they do not realize when the Stamp Act is repealed is that the British government has tacked on to the repeal of this specific act something called the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act is something very important. Okay, colonists, we'll repeal this act because you don't like it. But we are tacking onto this repeal an affirmed right by Parliament to make laws governing the colonies in any way it sees fit. I'm sure you can all see the danger here. And if you can't, when you attend Friday's drill down, if that's what your plan is, I can reaffirm it for you. They're saying, okay, this act is repealed, but we're underscoring the fact that we can make rules for you by any means necessary. What might be something comparable? Okay, let's say your parents allow you to drive with their permission, but you take the car keys because you feel you really need to get someplace and you really need to do something, and your parents didn't necessarily understand that need or were unresponsive to it, so you just took the car keys. And when you bring the car back, everything explodes between you and your parents. And you explain to your parents you felt what you needed to do was really, really urgent. And your parents say to you, okay, we'll give you a pass on this one. We're not going to punish you. We understand your perspective. But don't you ever take those car keys again without our permission. Don't even think about it. We are affirming the fact that the car keys remain in our control, and that if you ever take them again, you're going to face a really stiff punishment. I'm sure many of us have been there at points in our lives when this has happened to us. Indeed, a lot of scholars have compared the disintegration of the relationship between Britain and its colonies as a teenager coming of age, because they feel that there are rules that no longer apply to them, and the parents reaffirming those rules and saying, you will obey these rules for as long as you live under our house. Well, the teenager is about to permanently leave the house. It has loved its parents. It's felt that it's had a good upbringing, but it feels that the relationship has to move on. And the parents are saying, no, it doesn't. You're still under our control. And the teenager, advancing in years, has saying, I'm sorry, but the relationship needs to be redefined on my terms. Accept that redefinition, or risk losing me, losing my affection. That is a personal parallel, if you will, to what is going on here with this degrading relationship. So let's take a look at the continued decay of this relationship between England and its 13 of its New World colonies that become known eventually as the United States. And one of these is the Boston Massacre. And when one looks at the rhetoric leading up to the American Revolution, you're struck by people taking sides, and people take sides in ways because they want to influence others, or because they see something as a very one-sided sense of a lack of fairness, or a one-sided sense of right. And that's just kind of the way of the world when one is trying to influence people to a side. But like so many elements of the events that lead to the American Revolution, a full 12 years. It's not something that happens very quickly. It actually unfolds quite slowly. The Boston Massacre is a complicated affair. This is an engraving by the well-known Paul Revere, who was a silversmith and also a creator of popular images known as broadsides that would have been kind of shown and swapped throughout the colonial world. It was really the best you could get for cheap visualized media. And Revere is part of this trade in what are called engravings because they're actually etched on metal and then then printed and hand tinted. And it shows a wildly inaccurate portrayal of an event known as the Boston Massacre. And I'll tell you how it's wildly inaccurate. First of all, you're seeing British soldiers known as lobsterbacks or redcoats because of the color of British uniforms. And why do you wear a uniform? So you can recognize your own on these smoky 18th century battlefields. Standing in formation and firing seemingly at an innocent band of American colonials who are doing nothing more than just standing there. And you even see, and some students have questioned me about, like, what is the story with the dog? Like, why is a dog there? And the dog is there because it's the artistic symbol going all the way back to the medieval period of fidelity or faithfulness. So the artist, being Paul Revere, is telegraphing to you that faith really rests on the side of the oppressed, and that's demonstrated by the little dog here. So that's Paul Revere's vision of it. I might also add that, as many of you, if not all of you, likely know, that this is a mixed crowd of people who are killed by the British Redcoats in this particular fracas. One of whom is a mariner by the name of Crispus Attucks, who's of a mixed heritage of African and Native American, and he's a free person of color. He is not enslaved, even though there are certainly enslaved people in Boston in the mid to late 18th century, which tells us something too, that the protesters against these events are drawn from various walks of society. Crispus Attucks sees his relationships lying with his fellow workers across the spectrum. So that is why he's part of a group of young men who are chiefly workers on docks, who start throwing snowballs with rocks in them at a parading detachment of British soldiers. They do not do this arbitrarily for no reason, just like the British don't shoot at them arbitrarily for no reason. There is a set of causes and effects here, however you interpret the right or wrong of it. Here's the story. As I've mentioned several times, in the wake of the 7 Years' War, Britain leaves a number of soldiers in the American colonies, and a lot of them are actually up in Canada trying to establish what Britain's relationship will be with that newly ceded colony to the British Empire, which comes to be known as Upper and Lower Canada. Lower Canada being farther north, so figure that one out. Upper Canada being the one that's closer to the American colonies, just for value-added confusion. These soldiers, for the most part, are young men who have been told through their training that they are representatives of the British monarch, that they are important people, even if they come from humble circumstances. They are armed, and they're also very bored. They don't have a whole lot to do. They drill, and they do a little training. And then what else do they do? Well, really, they don't do anything. They do get paid for their soldiering. So what they do in their boredom is basically undercut the work that needs to be done by Boston's own citizens. They're going to docks and saying to a foreman, if you will, or a merchant, oh, I'll unload that vessel or get my friends to do it for half the price. And they'll just make a little money on the side while they're also being paid and cared for as soldiers. In the meantime, the economy in Boston is very poor at this time, as it is kind of throughout the colonies. And all of these men are basically either thrown out of work or see their work for the traditional wages that they would get as undercut by these British soldiers. So this is the background of these tensions that exist between the local Boston population and the soldiers who are stationed there. And there are going to be fracas, fracases, whatever the Latin plural is of that word, throughout the colonies between young colonial men who see their work prospects shrivel up because there are colonial soldiers who are willing to do their work for less money simply because they're bored and they have nothing better to do. So why not amass a little money on the side? Rarely do these events turn homicidal and or deadly, I should say, but it's one of the reasons why we really remember the Boston Massacre. In the winter of 1770, specifically March 5th of 1770, there is a lot of tension in Boston over the issue of taxation, over Britain's increased attempts to put taxes on items that the colonists then refuse because they don't import these items. This is something called a boycott, but it means a lot of people are hungry, a lot of people are doing without, and then the lack of work and economic collapse on top of it. These young men see an opportunity to vent their frustrations on these British soldiers. The British soldiers, in confusion and probably in pain, do not come into formation. They just kind of randomly start shooting into this crowd of people. And indeed, it's considered such a mixed event in its time that the soldiers themselves are represented in a court of law by none other than John Adams. John Adams, who is going to become kind of the uber revolutionary, is actually going to be the attorney who represents these soldiers when a colonial court insists that they have committed an act of murder and they claim that it was self-defense. So the Boston Massacre, like many things, complex, like many things, prior to getting to the point of the actual killings, is a complex issue leading to the revolution. But you can really see clearly these two sides of the revolution continuing to degrade through a number of serious factors. And what is the ultimate act of degradation? Well, a long string of failed acts that ultimately results in an act that the British government believes the colonists will welcome. The British East India Company has a surplus of tea and it's stored in warehouses in other British ports. And the tea is just going nowhere. The British East India Company is broke. The Crown has underwritten its activities and it still keeps losing money. It's a very bad economic situation. So I believe it was actually Lord Greville comes up with the idea of if we impose a very, very, very puny tax on tea and send all this surplus tea over to the colonies, we can sell it at a cut rate because at least we'll be selling it. At least we'll be getting this inventory out of the warehouses. And we'll be giving the colonists something they like. They love their tea. They drink a whole lot of it. It's the beverage of choice by the people who can afford it. And it's actually made very affordable through the relationship with Britain. Pretty much everyone drinks tea who is at power to choose what they eat and drink in this colonial world. So this seems like a win-win. Send this cheap tea across the Atlantic Ocean with a penny per pound. That is a British penny at the time, which is almost as much of a nothing as an American penny is in the current day. Appended to its cost and establish this precedent. The Americans would never say no, they like their tea too much. Well, the first reaction is the Americans are going to immediately boycott tea. They're going to say, we're not going to buy tea, we're not going to consume tea, we will not take tea. Then these ships start to arrive with the actual inventory. And Americans refuse to unload the tea from the vessels. Now, by law, the tea needs to be unloaded within 3 weeks of the mooring of the vessel that brought it, and the tax needs to be paid. The tax will need to be paid. The tea should be taken off the vessel, put into a warehouse, the tax is paid, and then the tea goes out to various distributors who will sell it to the colonists. The Americans refuse to unload the tea from these vessels. They just say, we're not going to do it. It's not going to happen. It's just going to sit there. We're not going to even put ourselves in a position to need to pay the tax. And they intimidate any attempts of British soldiers to undercut their work as what would be called longshoremen, and go in there and unload these vessels. So there's a man involved in this whole affair by the name of Thomas Hutchinson. And Thomas Hutchinson was the great-grandson of Anne Hutchinson, for whom the Hutchinson River Parkway is named. Thomas Hutchinson is the colonial governor of the state of Massachusetts, and he is extremely loyal to the British Crown. If Thomas Hutchinson had behaved like colonial administrators, and even those Stamp Act collectors that I talked about earlier in this lecture behaved and said, I know my duty, I know my responsibility, I cannot execute it at the moment because the situation is too hot here. We again all might have different passports. We might be more intimately connected to Canada than we ever thought. And yet he does not. Thomas Hutchinson engages in a stare down of the radical elements of Boston, led by lawyers and led by sailors who together, and working men who together have created a loosely based rebellious organization called the Sons of Liberty. And they say, and Hutchinson says, you're not going to humiliate me in the eyes of my king. You are going to unload this tea. You are going to see it delivered to the warehouses, and the tax will be paid. And the Boston Radicals do something that would be the equivalent of giving both Hutchinson and the British monarch and all of Parliament a big, big, big middle finger. The night before the tea tax is due, which is December 16th, 1773, a group of men dressed as Mohawk Indians, and this is a very specific case. They know no one's going to mistake them for Mohawk Indians. Mohawk Indians live near Canada. So no, everybody knows these aren't Indians breaking onto this vessel. This is masquerade. This is an opportunity to hide your identity so that you can engage in one of the most memorable acts of civil disobedience ever enacted in recorded history. These Mohawk Indians are going to board a moored vessel that carries tea called the Dartmouth, and 2 other vessels as well. It is going to be an extraordinarily limited act of violence against property. They break a padlock, they replace a padlock because they don't want to be seen as a destructive force. One might be tempted to think that it was this big boisterous affair of going into the hold of the vessel and taking this tea and throwing all of this tea into the harbor. In effect, it is kind of a razor sharp, targeted event where the rebels simply steal the tea, open up what were called the boxes that hold it are called tea caskets, empty out the caskets, chuck the caskets in Boston Harbor, go back and get another one. It's enacted in near silence. One man is trying to steal some tea by putting it in his pockets. His friends actually take his clothing and take his tea and send him home in disgrace, naked through the streets of Boston on one of the coldest nights of the year. Because that was not the goal. The goal was not to steal the tea. The goal was to destroy the tea, to demonstrate very, very, very vividly that the tea tax would not be paid. This is a grand gesture, As I said, it's kind of a collective middle finger, if you will, to all British administration, ranging from the local under Thomas Hutchinson, going all the way to Parliament and the monarch, King George III himself. And it's a gesture that everybody understands. And they're not going to stand for it. Parliament is furious that these rebellious colonists had dared to do this and dared defy the law on this level. In response to this, they are going to issue a group of acts called the Coercive Acts. And coercive means to get somebody to do something. What do they want the colonists to do? To behave the king's laws as they had been designed by Parliament and to do their duty. From the American perspective, they are called the Intolerable Acts. Here's why. They consist of 4 parts, but the ones I'm really going to focus on are twofold. They insist that until the tea tax and the destroyed tea is paid for, that the port of Boston will be closed to all further commerce. That's number 1. And that American colonists are going to be required to give housing to British officers, whether they want to or not. So that's an element 2. You have no choice but to have your property commandeered by the person that you now really perceive as your enemy. And the port is closed to all economic activity. Well, if your port is closed to all economic activity, in the 18th century, you're really running a risk of starvation. I mean, this is a tremendous problem. It's basically ending all economic activity in Boston and in Boston's countryside. So this is a big crisis. Second of all, how do you close a port? In the 18th century, you take enormous seagoing vessels called frigates or ships of the line. They have a variety of names. Some of these vessels have 72 cannons mounted on them. And these ships are arrayed in a circle, the stern of the ship, which is the butt of the ship, next to the bow close to the bow of the one behind it, which is the front of the ship. And their gun decks are cleared for action. If anyone attempts to trade out of this harbor, they are going to shoot. Okay, so that would be bad, but let me put it into context for you. This is the equivalent for a wooden city, as Boston chiefly was in the 18th century, of placing a nuclear weapon in the city and saying, if the people in this city don't abide by this law, we're going to detonate this weapon and destroy this city. This is really what we're looking at. And this was a profound expression of tyranny, not just to radicals in Boston, where radicals really tended to coalesce. I mean, this conflict really kind of starts as a New England thing and then becomes more generalized throughout the other colonies. But now, to everyone, this is seen as an extraordinarily scary act of intimidation by the British government. And many of those who were inclined to think that there must be some even ground, or we're misunderstanding each other, we're missing something, and we can really get together on this, and this crisis can end, are now shifting their opinion to think that the British really are tyrants and they are out to end American liberties. The colonial response to this threat is an interesting one. All up and down the east coast of what is now the United States, excluding Florida, which is still part of the Spanish New World or claimed by Spain, Americans are pondering what can be done in the face of this naked show of tyranny. Keep in mind, and this is extraordinarily important, that not all Americans are in the camp of the rebels who really want a show of strength to limit what the British Empire can do in America. That's really what this has been all about, or demand representation. Some are committed to being loyal to the monarch no matter what. Others just want to try to not get involved. But what happens with the intolerable acts is a real um, forcing of the hand of colonial leaders who see in what is happening in Boston, effectively this realistic threat of all-out destruction if a colony doesn't obey the British Empire as a threat to all. Prior to this time, and really up to and into the 7 Years' War, each of these 13 colonies had had a separate relationship with England. Sometimes they did not play nicely with one another or really acknowledge one another at all. They had very, very little to unify them, except for the fact that they were all located in the same rough geographical region, which would have been from Maine, which was part of Massachusetts or considered Massachusetts, all the way down to Georgia, and had moved a bit to the west. So you have this region of 13 little countries, if you will, or places seeing themselves as individual countries. This feeling of one's colony or one's state being their country persists until this day. People still talk about their state as their country, particularly in the American South, which I find bizarre. But anyway, I'm not going to go there. So anyway, that is where the mindset is for colonies and for their leaders. We all have our individual relationships with England. We all must deal with those relationships in the best way we know how. With the intolerable acts, though, you get this drive to form a united response to Britain, that there must be some form of united response, not only potentially to England itself, but also to support a fellow colony in ways that really have not been demonstrated before. The solution is what we call the First Continental Congress, where each state, or sorry, each colony, there's still colonies at this point, is going to send representatives to Philadelphia, which is kind of a midway point, and it's actually pretty much the largest city in what will become the United States, in colonial United States, to discuss what their solutions will be or what their responses might be should England take this threat even further. How should we support Massachusetts as it faces this possibility of destruction? How should we respond if we ourselves face similar threats? And what can we expect from our fellow colonies? So the Continental Congress, known really as the First Continental Congress, because there will be a second one that won't be dissolved really until the revolution is over, basically just sits down and talks and says, okay, what can be done? How can it be done? What do we need to do in response to this British threat? Well, we agreed that we will have a somewhat united response, whatever that may be. We agree on certain fundamentals, which are resistance to British tyranny, whenever the time may be. It may not be appropriate all the time, but it might be appropriate sometimes. And we will defend our territory, our colonial territory, if called upon to do so, and we will support one another in that. So it's really the first time that these colonies have set representatives for each colony and devised a uniform plan that's going to affect all of them and that unites them in a common response to an increasingly ratcheted up set of threats from the British government. And then what happens to the Continental Congress? It dissolves. They draw up their set of resolutions, they have their resolutions, and they all go home late in 1774. And then 1775 happens, specifically April 19th, 1775. Boston is put under martial law, which is military rule, as I alluded to before, but I didn't say so explicitly, so I apologize. It's been put under martial law, and that means that its citizens are not allowed to take up firearms for their own defense. Certainly, citizens could keep their firearms for things like hunting and personal protection, but basically the little local bands of ad hoc soldiers called militias have have been dissolved, or are supposed to have been dissolved by the military leader in charge of Boston, a man by the name of Thomas Gage, whose wife was a spy, by the way, a spy for the Americans. So all of these little local armies, which were really meant for protection against the French and stuff like that, or Native American hostilities with Native Americans, were supposed to disband. Gage's office in Boston gets wind of a rumor that there is a very, very large storehouse of weapons at a place called Concord, Massachusetts, which is 16 miles north of Boston. And it's presumed that at some time, local rebellious militiamen are going to take those arms and use them against the British. So the British solution against this is to seize these weapons, to take them away from the colonists and deprive them from having weapons. Remember, not everybody has a gun. Guns are expensive. Guns are hard to repair. The fewer guns you have around, essentially, the safer you will be then as now. But the idea is to really get these weapons out of the potential hands of rebels. So detachments of British soldiers are told to march on Concord and seize these weapons, seize them in the name of the king and in the name of Parliament, that it's illegal for the colonists to have them in their midst, and they're certainly not going to be able to have the opportunity to use them. Several days before this, the colonists get wind of the fact that this is going to happen. And this is really the line that is drawn in the sand, a line drawn from the Alamo, which we'll talk about later this semester. But it is a determination that a stand is going to be made to protect these weapons and keep them from falling into British hands. How did the Americans know it was going to happen? A spy in the Gage household, and very possibly, as I said, Margaret Gage, Thomas Gage's wife, tells the rebels that the British are going to come and seize these weapons. The British start marching out of Boston very slowly, as armies usually do, on their 16-mile trek to Concord, which was actually pretty far by 18th century standards, on foot in your uniform in warm weather. They get a few miles outside of Boston to a village called Lexington. And there, in the common general area known as the Green, all New England, or most New England towns have them, they are met by a line of militia. And the militia say, you will go, you shall not pass, if you will. If any of you are fans of Tolkien, as I am, this is the moment of you shall not pass. You're not going to go any further. We're going to stop you from marching farther north to Concord and achieving your goal. And the British officer yells out, disperse, you rebels. And actually, the American militia commander was going to give the order to disperse when somebody fires. And a melee ensues. The British start to fire. The Americans start to fire. Several Americans are wounded and killed. And let me tell you, if you're hit by 18th century shot from a flintlock musket, that's a weapon that can do a whole lot of damage. So it becomes a really terrifying event in which people lose their lives. And we call it the Battle of Lexington. The Americans withdraw in disarray, and the British continue their march on Concord to seize those weapons. Something quite remarkable happens, though. All around their route, their one road to get up to Concord, which they need, they can't just go overland ad hoc, they need to use the road. American colonists start to shoot at them from behind hedgerows, from behind stone walls, from behind buildings, from the second stories of houses, from barns. Wherever they can shield themselves and intimidate the soldiers, they do. The soldiers will break rank and basically run back to Boston in terror. So we've had this killing of American subjects, if you will, English subjects living in America at Lexington. Blood has been spilled. And then you have those same subjects shooting at the armed and uniformed emissaries of the king and parliament on the road to Concord, which the bottom line is blood has been spilled. And it's not something that the king is going to forget, nor Parliament. This is a really egregious act from their perspective. And the Americans are kind of afraid because nobody thought blood would necessarily be spent this way. But it has happened in the spring of 1775. The Continental Congress that I described in the last slide will reconvene as the Second Continental Congress to try to work with the situation of, now that blood has been spilled, what's really going to happen here and what should our response be? They will never unconvene until the end of hostilities that we know of as the American Revolution. And they will stay seated as the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia until they have to flee briefly when the British take over, or when the British invade Philadelphia, pardon. Sorry, folks, I just have to turn on the fan here. It's getting a little toasty in this room. Okay, all right. So getting to the topic at hand. So this slide shows the Battle of Lexington, right? But our topic here is the Declaration of Independence. How do we get to that? The Second Continental Congress convenes. In the meantime, there are more fracases, if you will, that occur in and around Boston between British soldiers and American militiamen, including one most memorable, known as the Battle of Bunker Old Breeds Hill, which the British actually win, but it shows them that the Americans are not to be trifled with on the battlefield. And the situation is increasingly getting hotter and hotter and hotter and worse and worse. The Second Continental Congress appeals directly to the king and sends one final message, known historically as the Olive Branch Petition. And the Olive Branch Petition says, please, there's been all of this tension between our two nations. Can't we please kind of come together? We will be dutiful children, but will you please be fair to us, and we can work things out. In Parliament and in the mind of the king himself, whose special advisors are his emissaries to Parliament, the time for negotiation is actually past. It is time to force the colonists to do their duty. They cannot be coerced. They cannot be, quote unquote, tamed into doing it, which would have been the terminology of the day. They cannot be enticed to do it. They must be made to do it by force. The Olive Branch Petition basically receives no response. What does happen is that Americans become aware of the fact that more and more soldiers and an entire British Navy are being moved across the Atlantic. It is the biggest known fighting force ever assembled in early modern history, and all of its power is going to be directed toward these 13 little American colonies that are so angry about this particular situation. That is enough. Eventually, no one talks of independence at first in either Continental Congress, but the threat of invasion now seems incredibly real. And that is going to be seen as the parting of the waters. Either we give in and we become these abject colonial members of the British world without any rights or any voice, or we seize this extreme opportunity to break off from the British Empire, to end this toxic relationship, if you will, once and for all. Not by a long shot is everyone for this in the colonial world. And yet, that will be the argument that will prevail, most notably from the voice of John Adams, one of the Boston radicals, who's one of the most articulate and argumentative of them all. He is also, by his own estimation, obnoxious and disliked, but he has been for quite some time a real advocate for breaking off from the British Empire fully and completely and declaring independence and home rule for the colonies. His argument, despite his own obnoxiousness and unlikableness, is going to be the one that now prevails. So what exactly did declaring independence mean, and what was the Declaration of Independence? I have to be honest, folks, at the beginning of every time that I teach this section, up close and personal, and this semester is no different, I ask students what came first, the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution? And about 50% of the class say the Declaration, and the other 50% give the other answer. In addition, I ask if the Declaration came before the war, the American Revolution, or after the war, and was a result of it. And again, it's about a 50-50 thing. So obviously only one answer can be right. And that one answer is that the Declaration of Independence is the official, signed, affirmed document that states a set of reasons why the colonists feel that they are right and just and appropriately emboldened to end their relationship with the British Empire and declare themselves free and independent states, which is the language taken from the Declaration itself. It was ratified July 2nd, 1776. But it becomes public knowledge July 4th, 1776. And of course, all of you know the association with that particular date. So that's when it becomes known to the colonists, some of whom may not agree with this at all and be very, very upset with this, that these 13 New World colonies, banded together by geography and by kind of common origins, are effectively ending their relationship with the British Empire, at least politically, that they are no longer seeing themselves as members of Britain's New World Empire. It's one of these moments or one of these things where sometimes students use state and colony interchangeably because they like to shake up the language chiefly. They like to show that they can use interesting language. Never, ever, ever, ever do that. The colonies that became the United States stopped being colonies by their own reckoning on July 4th, 1776. By the end of that day, they considered themselves states. Whenever we talk about these places from now on, they are states. They were not states before. They should only be referred to as colonies. As I've said before with historical language, even if you have to use the same word 15 times, as long as it's the proper word, that's all I care about. They were not states prior to July 4th, 1776. On July 4th, 1776, they became states, and to this point, they have not gone back. Let's hope that that continues. Anyway, I just wanted to make that very, very clear. It is the document that starts the war. England is furious. But regardless, England was going to make the colonists come back to heel according to what the British Empire wanted, regardless. They had withdrawn their armies from Massachusetts, and now all of their armies were rendezvousing in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is part of Lower Canada. And they were amassing themselves for a tremendous invasion. So then what did this Declaration of Independence do? First of all, it permanently brings these colonies together in common cause. They now see themselves as having one cause to fight for, and being all of their efforts being organized around achieving the goal of that clause, which is getting Britain to recognize that they are independent. If you recognize a nation is independent, you're not going to fight to get it back as part of your empire. So that is the whole goal. Make Britain acknowledge and respect the fact that they are independent. Guess what? Britain is not going to acknowledge or respect this until 1863. But we will have a treaty that, at least in political terms, recognizes that in 1783. So we're getting there. So that is the goal of declaring independence. It also gives them a body of ideas and rhetoric to coalesce around and fight for. It uses the language of freedom. It's going to use the language of escape from tyranny. It's going to use the language of independence. It's going to use the language of natural rights and the ability of people to govern themselves. Of course, many of these things are going to seem very hypocritical to us because when they talk about people or citizens or subjects, they're going to be talking about white males of a certain socioeconomic background. Yet to them, in their 18th century world, this was radical. This was giving people who were not aristocrats or noble or landowners back in England the right to govern themselves in greater numbers and coming from greater variety of backgrounds than they ever had before. So this declaration is just the start of things, and yet it's going to mean everything. It's going to give voice, it's going to give shape, and it's going to give desire to this conflict. It's going to give something else. Britain, by virtue of the fact that it's been growing stronger and more powerful and more aggressive, has alienated a bunch of other European nations and their monarchs. It's alienated, well, the Spanish and the French have hated England for a really long time. And even though sometimes the Spanish are at peace with them, that dislike still has not changed. The Dutch, even though they are a fellow Protestant empire, they hate the English too. The English have gone into West Africa and taken over a variety of their most lucrative trade relationships. Never mind that the Dutch had taken those from the Portuguese, and never mind that the Portuguese had taken them from the original people who had lived there, who were the various West African nations there. But they are steamed about that. This declaration is going to be, and the fight that ensues to see that it is actually executed, to see that it is realized, the recognition of these free and independent states is going to be watched with tremendous care by other European nations. At first, they're going to kind of hang around on the sidelines and just see what happens. And then, as the Americans start scoring victories against the British, they are going to be more and more inclined to be involved. And we'll talk about that involvement in just a slide or two. But let's talk about each side. And when I say balance of power, this is what I mean. The British bring certain things to this conflict that are very much to their advantage. And the Americans bring certain things to this conflict that are very much to their advantage. I will map out a couple of the British ones, and then I'll map out some of the American ones. So, what do the British bring to the table? They bring a well-trained professional fighting force and a navy. And you might say, well, you know, whatever, big deal. We need to understand the context of the Navy. The Navy is a branch of the armed services. And as such, they fight. You might think, well, they sail on ships. How much fighting can they do? They can do a lot. They can disrupt harbors. They can disrupt enemy trade. They can keep American cities from getting fortified with items from other helpful nations that might want to see this effort survive. They might be able to blockade and basically starve out a city and make it comply with orders. Having that navy is really, really critical. The British and the French have the most fearsome navies at the end of the 18th century. The British are actually going to eclipse the French in the 19th, but at this point, the British and the French are fairly well matched. But the British have one of the two most powerful navies. So that navy is extremely important. These are, think of naval vessels as basically floating forts, if you will. And those forts can engage in shipping and totally disrupt it. They can disrupt maritime communities and trade in the countryside, all sorts of stuff an effective navy can do. In addition, they have a professionally trained fighting force with uniforms, with state-of-the-art weapons, with well-trained horses, which are extremely important to warfare in the 18th century. They have some very, very good data on the American countryside and American geography. So it's kind of a place they know to a certain degree. And very importantly, in certain cities, specifically in New York and also in Philadelphia, they have a lot of people who are loyal to England and want to see England prevail in this conflict. They do not want independence. They are people who are derisively at times called Tories. The more appropriate term is loyalist. And they have these feelings for a variety of reasons. When I was a little kid, I learned that Tories were just bad, stupid people who were on the wrong side of history. Well, if you are an enslaved African living in Virginia and you have a colonial planter who's rebelling against the king, and then the agent of the king sends out word to all of the enslaved people in the countryside that if they fight for the king, therefore if they are Tories, if you will, that they will get their freedom, you might be really interested in adopting that side because not all situations are the same. So there's one reason to be a Tory. Another reason might be because you're a devoutly religious person, and there are revolutionaries and devoutly religious people on both sides of this conflict. But your religious calibration might tell you a king is ordained by God to be a king. And by going against a king, you're going against God. So you wouldn't want to do that either. In addition, a lot of loyalists who live in cities trade with England. And they know that if this conflict really, really rises, that their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor is going to be on the line, that their trade relationships that they value so much are going to be completely disrupted. And they don't want to see that happen. So there are a few reasons why you might want to be loyal to England. And there were a lot of these people. In addition, some of the most important loyalists are Native American groups. Native American groups that had very little love or affection for the American colonists themselves, who had been beaten up by them, who had been abused by them, who had been murdered by them, who had been attacked by them, frequently unjustly, simply because they were Native people. So if one Native person was thought to do something, all Native people were considered guilty. If the British Empire is removed from North America, that would spell disaster for Native people. Many of them know it and will side with the British Empire because then they can continue to have bargaining chips. Americans, if you're not nice to us, we'll go to the British. British, if you're not nice to us, we'll go to the Americans. If you take away one of those bargaining chips, as the French have been taken away, then suddenly you're at the mercy of the Americans. You all know what happens. The Americans win this conflict. And here is one of my definitive statements that will be a guiding principle for the rest of the semester. The American Revolution is a disaster for Native people and enslaved people. I'll repeat it. The American Revolution is a disaster for Native American people and enslaved people. How it's a disaster is going to be a subject that we'll touch on multiple times in future lectures. So let's talk about the advantage of the American rebels, who tend to be coalesced under one term, patriot. Okay, you might say, boy, she pronounced that funny, isn't it? Patriot, isn't it the Boston Patriots? And like, who likes them? But just take a look at the word. It's patriot. That is the proper way to pronounce it. That's the way to spell it. It's not patriot, like drum majorette or something like that. Patriot connotes something little, something diminutive. This is the proper term. So I hope that when people use it, they'll start to use it instead of ETTE with the recognition that it's an OT at the end. So who are patriots? Patriots are people who support American independence in this conflict. And of course, they take on all sorts of different terms at different times. For the purposes of this particular time in history, they're the supporters of independence and of the Second Continental Congress. They are also the people who commit themselves to fight against the British when the need be, to supply the Americans if need be, to give information to them, to give food to them, to give housing to them, to give medicine to them, medical care, animals, whatever the need may be. So the way one expresses one's patriotism comes from a variety of backgrounds. There is no one group that really tends to be loyalist or one group that tends to be patriotic. You find people of multiple backgrounds representing both sides. And you also find a bunch of people in the middle who are just trying really hard to be neutral. But the patriots have a few things on their side. First of all, they have more knowledge of the land than the British do. The British have some knowledge born out of the 7 Years' War and the fact that they've been hanging around for 12 years afterward. But the Americans have much more robust knowledge of their own countryside, so that will help them. They also tend to have that home team support. They don't get that uniformly, but they tend to get that more than they get rejection from the people in the countryside. So they have that. They also, even though they lack state-of-the-art weapons, they also have this kind of defensive zeal for the fact that they're defending their homes. These British soldiers aren't defending their homes. They're defending for the king some attenuated version of empire. Well, that's not the case with the actual Americans. They feel like they are defending home. And to that end, who actually fights, who actually takes up arms, becomes a very, very complicated story. Oh, and then just lastly, before I go to the last side, they also have rhetoric on their side. What are they talking about? They're using the language of freedom. They're using the language of self-determination, of independence, of God-given rights to every human being. Forget the hypocrisies of that in the 18th century. And they can use that language very, very effectively. And then they have one more advantage. When the British come to the various colonies and they see something that they need or want, they tend to take it in the name of the king and parliament and the common weal of the British Empire. And that really annoys people. People don't like it. And by the way, that can go as far as acts of sexual violence. If they see a colonial woman they want, they might, they will, ravish or sexually coerce that colonial woman. So they tend to be very abusive toward the local population. And this gets some people who might have been well inclined toward the British soldiers to think, oh, wow, they're really hammering home that not only are we second class people in the British Empire, but we're even worthy of being abused, and abused in some really terrible ways. We didn't know that we were in for that. The Americans tried to walk a very, very, very fine line. If they need something, Washington, well, specifically the main army made up of representatives of all 13 colonies called the Continental Army, will ask for it. Or they'll pay in something called continental dollars, money that they issued that could hopefully be paid back once the country becomes independent and establishes its own economy. So it's a difference in kind of spin doctoring and press as well. The British get very bad press as being thieves and rapists, and they were in a lot of cases. The Americans tried to walk a really fine line. Speaking of George Washington, one other thing. George Washington is going to be famous for running away. And I am not saying that he was a coward or he is misunderstood in this regard. He becomes well known for when he needs to back off of a conflict with the British, with a British army. There are multiple British armies in the United States at this point. He knows almost instinctively when the situation is getting too hot, when he might suffer a loss from which he can't recover, and he retreats and he runs away. And often that's a very strategic form of running that really presses his army to their max. So he's not a great winner of battles as a military tactician, even though some of his generals are better than he is. But he knows when to retreat. And when you're on the defensive tactically, this means that you live to fight another day. That's really important. The Americans will eventually succeed in wearing the British down. And that is enormously important to their eventual success in this conflict. So let's talk a little bit about people of color in the revolution. And I alluded to it in the last slide. So I'm going to talk about it a little more. This is a very interesting drawing made by a French officer. And I'll explain how the French come into the picture in a little bit, showing the diversity of the Americans. And as you can see, all four of these men are wearing different uniforms. They have different weapons. I have to be perfectly honest, I'm not really sure what that is. It looks like a caduceus, so it's making him look like he's a doctor, but I don't believe that's what it is. I kind of don't know what it is. Maybe it's some sort of war club or cat of nine tails. I don't know. Who knows? I'm sure somebody does, but it's not me right at this moment. Pointing out the diversity of American soldiers and the fact that Americans who take up arms against the British are indeed a diverse lot of people. And you find among them a significant number of people of color, including some who do incredible heroic acts. For example, a man by the name of Peter Salem, who actually uh, succeeds in killing the British officer at the Battle of Breed's Hill. He makes his way up the hill at the front of the line and shoots him almost point blank, and makes this British detachment under this guy named Major Pitcairn fall apart. Um, why would you commit yourself to this conflict? Well, for a couple of reasons. Even people of color who are free, and there are quite a lot of them at the time of the American Revolution, there's a large percentage of free people of color. It doesn't mean that they are free uh, for self determination. There is still a large amount of racism in America. It will continue that way. Many see the evidence of it accreting on a regular basis that it is still that way in many cases. Um, but it did not mean that you had the right or the ability to access a business, to actually succeed economically, to have all lines of work opened up to you. That wasn't the case. So you see even free men of color still on the lower socioeconomic rungs of American society. Um, these men um, might have been very intrigued by the ideological formulations of rebellion. Why do you rebel? It could mean freedom. It could mean freedom for me personally. It could mean freedom for my family. It could mean this idea of nation building in which race becomes a diminished part, or a part that doesn't exist anymore. And that here's my opportunity to demonstrate why it shouldn't, but through valor on the battlefield. There's also the fact that in some, but very few cases, enslaved people were offered their freedom either as substitutions or as conscripts in armies if they would fight. For those of you who are fans of a really quite awful film called The Patriots, starring Mel Gibson, that did not happen in South Carolina, as that film demonstrates. It simply didn't. Nothing put fear in the heart of a slaveholder like a man of color with a firearm that he knew how to use. So Southern planters were not inclined to do this. And actually, George Washington did not appreciate having people of color within the ranks of the Continental Army. And yet, many people of color are eligible to fight for other reasons and will become viable fighting members. In addition, however, we have the fact that the British recognize that there is this discontented population of people of color, in these rebelling states, uh, who are enslaved. And if the British can work up appropriate rhetoric to get them engaged, then they can make them fight toward their former masters and fight for the cause of Britain. So when we say people of color or blacks in the revolution, we're really talking about a tremendous variety of motives and backgrounds that illustrate the sheer diversity of people of color and their experiences as the United States turns from a set of colonies into a set of states and then one coalesced state of the United States. There's something else that can't be discounted, and this affects white as well as black soldiers. Soldiering was a way to get food and money and shelter for a period of time. This was a solution for poverty. And a lot of soldiers are going to take advantage of the fact that this is a solution to poverty with the hope that they will be on the winning side and that a better life for them will possibly be waiting on the other end. But during the period of 2 or 3 or 1 year of their enlistment, they're getting food, they're getting shelter, they're getting clothes, they're getting a weapon. These are all presumptions. In actuality, a lot of these soldiers deal without these things for a long period of time. They're getting medical treatment, and they're bored most of the time, because by no means is soldiering even 50% of their time. It's actually a very small percentage of it. So there is that factor as well, and that affects many young men and many middle-aged men, and even some children. We find boys as young as 13 or 14 enlisting in the army as drummers. And why would you need drummers? Because they signal movements, and they let you know where friend and foe are, and then eventually evolving up to the status of soldier. So, just about done here, folks. I know this was a very long lecture. The rest will not be this long. I'm going to make that very clear. Let's talk about strategy and what the initial strategy of the British is. In 1775, after the battles of Lexington and Concord, a few things happen. I'm not going to go through all of these points, and this is kind of confusing, even though you should enjoy looking at this map. It's a really good one, and it tells you a lot about the military strategy, which, just for your information, I find very, very, very interesting. And I go through this in a lot more detail when I teach this in an upper level course, but for now it needs to be quick. The British are basically chased back from Concord and Lexington all the way back into Boston, where they take up defensive positions in Boston itself. The Americans are going to take up opposing positions that are higher than the British positions, and are eventually going to intimidate them out of Boston. But the British aren't done. What they're going to do is get themselves together, and they are going to evacuate to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where they're going to await reinforcements, and then they're going to come back to the United States, these little colonies that are now declaring that they are free and independent states, and they are going to give them what for. But the British remain convinced that most of the trouble is in New England. I'm sorry, I keep losing my cursor on this computer. I'm not sure why. Is in New England. And if they can almost quarterize New England, if they can cut it off from the rest of the colonial world like a cancer, that then the entire rebellion is just going to fall apart. So that is basically their goal. Their goal will be to kind of surround New England by sea and by river and by land, and cut it off from communication with anyone else. And they feel that this rebellion is going to fall apart. It's only after they're on the ground for a few years that they realize that this rebellion is generalized, and there's a lot more passion behind it, and a lot more material to allow the rebellion to continue than they ever considered. Their goal is going to be to come up the Hudson River and form a western boundary to kind of isolate New England this way. And then they will blockade, and they will make their center of activity New York City. I'm sorry, I'm circling white planes there. New York City. Why New York City? They think it's filled with loyalists. And guess what? It is. But it's not so filled with loyalists that it doesn't have patriots either. So in 1776, you have the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. 6 weeks later, if you had woken up in New York City, which is really just the tip of Manhattan Island, you would have seen a terrifying sight. Unless you were a loyalist, then you'd be happy. You would see an ocean of masts from vessels moving towards you like a moving forest, a huge British invasionary force. By the way, if you were a loyalist, you'd probably be pretty apprehensive as well, because you'd know that fighting was coming to your area in one way or another. And they're going to settle in New York. They will take New York and they will commence their work of trying to isolate New England. George Washington, who has pulled together a small army called the Continental Army. It is actually its well-being is cared for by the Second Continental Congress, but not too well because they have no money. Will come down to engage with the British in New York, and what will happen is a series of disasters that basically kicks the Americans out of New York and forces them to focus their area here in New Jersey as the British attempt to come up the Hudson River and isolate New England. So the British are going to come to New Jersey. I mean, the Americans are going to come to New Jersey. They're going to be attempting to keep Philadelphia safe while the British are in New York and formulating their other plans. They're going to find the countryside around New York more difficult to take than they thought. Actually, our Westchester County is a civil war at this point. Half are patriot, half are loyalists, and they're beating the living crap out of each other. They hate each other. War is kind of the perfect guise for doing that. So they have to deal with that situation. Eventually, their plan is going to be for one massive three-pronged attack, where an army and naval forces are going to come up the Hudson River in the summer of 1777. And there they will meet with a major British army that has come down from Canada and another British army that comes through the central part of New York State, picks up scads of Native American allies and hopefully some loyalists. They'll all rendezvous around Albany and then all finish off the work of isolating New England. This doesn't happen. This army, under a man named Barry St. Ledger, is going to encounter steep resistance in the Mohawk Valley from patriot farmers and the few Native American allies that keep him from moving forward. For some reason that historians still kind of scratch their heads around, the prong that was supposed to come out of New York City under General William Howe is going to say, you know what, we're going to change our tactic. We're going to go after Philadelphia instead. And so they basically go in the other direction and leave these other two guys out to dry. And then the third prong, the most notorious of these, is under a man by the name of John Burgoyne. And Burgoyne thinks that he's going to have actually a very pleasant summer going through the American countryside with his army and with his girlfriends, of which he has several, and he has a bunch of hunting dogs with him and cases of champagne and a really nice wardrobe and stuff like that. They completely underestimate what it is like to travel this wooded corridor between Canada and upper New York State to get to their rendezvous point. And they end up wasting valuable weeks trying to chop their way through dense forest for which they have no map. As a byproduct of that, they are slowed down, they are hungry, their horses have given out, and just northeast of Albany, in a place called Bennington, they are fought back in a skirmish by local farmers. And then they kind of shoulder on to Saratoga, which is just north of Albany, where they meet a major American army under the still loyal Benedict Arnold, and they are defeated. 7,600 British soldiers are taken captive, including John Burgoyne himself, at what becomes known as the Battle of Saratoga. Why do we fixate on it, and why did I call it out like this as an important event? Because those other Europeans who are sitting on the sidelines, the Spanish, the Dutch, and most especially the French, those people who would like to sink their boots into the butt of the British Empire, are like, okay, the Americans have demonstrated that they don't just run away and wear down the British Army or various British armies, they can actually fight them and win. Here they have a real decisive battlefield win, and the French come into the picture. Don't let anyone knock the French. We have our independence because of them. And I'll explain why in the next slide. I'm going to, because of time's sake, bypass a lot of strategy, which I reiterate, I really do love, but really can't be attended to at this point. Just to make the point that the Americans have great successes in either wearing the British down with nothing decisive, or engaging them successfully on battlefields, enough so that by the summer of by the winter of 1777, the British are going to say, okay, I think we need a new plan. And this plan is going to be to move to the south. So after a successful attempt at disrupting life in the American South at Charleston, they're eventually going to be repulsed, but they do a good deal of damage. By 1780, they're going to say, okay, we really need to change our strategy. We believe that the American South is filled with these people called loyalists. And if we can get the loyalists on our side, then we can secure the lower states and then move north and take the other ones with a really coalesced power. What they underestimate is that there are many loyalists in the South, but there are also many patriots. And these, again, like in Westchester County, are two groups that absolutely hate each other. What the British succeed in doing by coming to the southern states of South Carolina and North Carolina and Virginia is opening up old wounds and settling of scores, which makes this conflict completely unpredictable to them. They walk into a powder keg of pre-existing hostilities, murder, horrible acts of violence of local people against local people that they simply cannot control. They have nothing decisive by 1781, and they decide that they can't do anything better than evacuate the South and go back to New York and re-strategize another plan. At this point, they have been fighting against the colonists for 6 years, and there have been no decisive battles that have really, really tipped the fortunes of the British. At this point, something else is happening in England. Remember what I told you a few slides ago. The British taxpayer, the people back in England, pay on average 10 times what American colonists ever paid to their little local legislators. They are getting angry. And the anti-war faction back in England is really, really ramping up. Why? Because the British have spent tons of money on this conflict. Money they didn't have in the first place. The whole reason why this conflict broke out in the first place. And they want peace, and they want an end to spending this money. In addition, the French have given the Americans tremendous material support. They have given them weapons, they have given them soldiers, they have given them uniforms. Now, something very interesting. The French soldiers who were committed by the French king come to Rhode Island and Connecticut, and they pretty much just hang out there for a period of several years. And Washington writes to the commander-in-chief, a man by the name of the Comte de Rochambeau, and says to Rochambeau, like, hey, will you join me in fighting here? I could really use your help. And Rochambeau says, nope, the time isn't right. I'm continuing to drill my soldiers and kind of live in New England and whatever. And then Washington writes again, can you help us out? And Rochambeau, who is a very seasoned soldier, says, nope, I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying where I am. The time isn't right. When is the time right? The time is right in the late summer of 1781. The British are in the process of evacuating the South because they've opened up this horrible civil war. They can't contain it. They can't make it work to their advantage. So a huge army by the name under a leader by the name of George Cornwallis leaves North Carolina, leaves the southern states to figure things out for themselves, and evacuates to a little peninsula very close to where the first successful English settlement was on the James River, a town called Yorktown. And there he's going to wait for British warships to come down from New York City to pick up him and his army and evacuate them and bring them back to New York. At that very same moment, a French admiral by the name of Admiral de Grasse, who has been sailing around protecting the French sugar islands in the Caribbean, writes to Rochambeau up in Rhode Island and says, "Hey, guess what? I have a few weeks where, my cruise is over. You need me to do anything on the American scene?" Rochambeau is going to say, "Why, yes, rendezvous with us at the Yorktown Peninsula." Washington is going to attempt to run south and bottle up the British on this little peninsula. Rochambeau is like, "Okay, guess what? The time is right. I'm joining in." They basically run down the coast from Rhode Island to Virginia, connect with Washington, and contribute to Washington's forces. And then de Grasse is going to come and bottle up the Chesapeake River so that the British have no escape. After weeks of siege, the British are going to be forced to surrender at Yorktown. At least Cornwallis will have to surrender. It's another major British army that has fallen. There has been nothing else that's conclusive on the British side. And back in England, the anti-war party is going to gain the upper hand. This conflict will fall apart. There will be little smatterings of skirmishes and battles here and there between 1781 and 1783. But for all intents and purposes, the real conflict, known as the American Revolution, ends when George Cornwallis surrenders his sword and surrenders his army to George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau at Yorktown in the early autumn of 1781. The United States, these United States, has won its independence from Great Britain. The terms of that independence just need to be hammered out and recognized. It'll take 2 years to come to the bargaining table, but it eventually will happen in the summer of 1873 when both sides meet in Paris to hammer out a treaty to formally end this conflict. So the question is, how is victory at last achieved? Through multiple ways. Number one, through the Americans' ability to wear the British down and to keep them from having a really decisive victory anywhere where the Americans can say, "Okay, we've got to throw down our arms. We're going to lose this thing." The Americans are very successful at that. And that is thanks to Washington, and then also thanks to his generals, and also thanks to various local militias that would fight to defend their local state. So that's number one. Number two, the British taxpayer, who was soaked even more during this conflict, which resulted in nothing, in no financial gain for England at all. So then wanting an end to this conflict. And then French intervention in terms of knowing strategically how to give its navy and to really lend its military expertise. The Americans are still rather ad hoc, but foreigners who come from France, who come from various German states, who come from Poland, are going to teach the Americans how to be better fighters and contribute armies of their own to help them. Those foreign fighters are going to be a major help as well. Okay, this has been a very long lecture. The rest of them will not be this long, I guarantee you. Thank you for sticking with it. And please bring any questions that you have or any requests for clarification to Friday's drill down session.